I found out I owed a neighborhood association $4,000 before I'd even had my first cup of coffee that morning. Not through a letter, not through a phone call. They nailed the notice directly to my barn door like it was some kind of public execution. Big red letters, threatening language, a deadline. And standing there in the early sunlight, staring at that piece of paper fluttering against wood that had been standing longer than most people in that county had been alive, I remember thinking, these people have completely lost their minds. My name's Jack Mercer, and for most of my life I've lived on the same stretch of land outside a little town in Eastern Tennessee. 3 generations of my family worked that property before me. My grandfather raised cattle there. My dad grew hay. I never got rich from it, but I never expected to. The place wasn't about money. It was about roots. At the center of the property sat an old tobacco barn. Now, if you've never seen one of those, don't picture something straight out of a magazine. This thing had scars, weathered boards, uneven corners, a roof line that wasn't exactly winning any architecture awards. But every mark on that building had a story attached to it. Back in 1994, a tornado clipped the edge of our property and nearly flattened the structure. Most people would have torn it down. My father refused. For an entire summer, we rebuilt it together. I was 16. He'd hand me nails and tell me where to stand. We'd work from sunrise until the heat got unbearable. Sometimes we'd barely say 10 words all day. Other times he'd tell stories about his father and grandfather while we hammered boards into place. One afternoon, I remember asking him why he cared so much about saving an old barn. He laughed and leaned on his hammer. Because most things worth keeping don't look valuable to everybody else. At the time, I didn't understand what he meant. Years later, standing there with that HOA notice in my hand, I finally did. The fine itself was ridiculous. For $1,000. Reason? Violation of community visual harmony standards. I actually laughed out loud when I read that part. Community? I wasn't part of their community. That was the problem. About 5 years earlier, a developer had bought hundreds of acres bordering my land. They built one of those upscale master plan neighborhoods. Stone entrance, decorative fountains, matching mailboxes, houses painted in 12 different shades of beige that somehow all looked exactly the same. The neighborhood was called Willow Ridge Estates. Even the name sounded expensive. My property sat completely outside their boundary lines. Different parcel, different ownership, different everything. Yet somehow they decided my barn was now their problem. As I stood there rereading the notice, my neighbor Earl happened to drive by in his old pickup. Earl slowed down, rolled down his window, and yelled, "You look like somebody just told you your dog joined a cult." I held up the paper. He read it. Then he laughed so hard he had to wipe tears from his eyes. "Oh, that's rich," he said. Those HOA folks finally ran out of people to boss around inside the gates. At first, I thought it had to be a mistake. Some overenthusiastic employee. Some paperwork mix-up. Something. Then I saw the signature at the bottom. Nathan Holloway, President, Willow Ridge Homeowners Association. That wasn't a mistake. That was deliberate. By late afternoon, a second notice appeared. This one warned of escalating penalties. The next morning, there was a third. That one mentioned legal enforcement actions. I started noticing something else too. Every notice seemed more aggressive than the last. It wasn't just about the barn anymore. It felt personal. Like somebody over there had looked across the fence line, seen my old family property, and decided it didn't fit the picture they wanted people to see from their brand new clubhouse. That evening, I finally called the number listed on the paperwork. A receptionist transferred me directly to Nathan Holloway. His voice was calm. Too calm. The kind of voice people use when they're accustomed to getting their way. I explained who I was. Explained that I didn't live in Willow Ridge. Explained that my property had existed decades before their development. There was a short pause. Then he said something I'll never forget. "Mr. Mercer, this isn't really about ownership. It's about maintaining standards that benefit the entire surrounding area." I stare at the phone. Surrounding area? Correct. You mean my property? Another pause. Then he said, "Visual impact extends beyond neighborhood boundaries." That was the moment everything changed. Because until then, I thought I was dealing with a misunderstanding. Now I realized I was dealing with something much worse. These people genuinely believed they had authority over land they didn't own. That night, I sat on the barn steps as the sun disappeared behind the hills. In the distance, I could see the lights of Willow Ridge turning on one by one. Perfect streets. Perfect landscaping. Perfect little picture. And sitting right in the middle of their view was my crooked old barn. I should have been angry. Instead, I found myself remembering my grandfather, because there was something he'd said years before while sorting through old documents in his attic. A sentence that suddenly came rushing back into my head. Most people think power comes from money, he told me. Real power comes from paperwork nobody bothered to read. At the time, I'd thought it was just another one of his old man sayings. But sitting there that night, looking toward Willow Ridge, I started wondering if maybe he knew something I didn't. And before I went to bed, I made a decision. The next morning I was going digging. Not in the dirt. In the records. Because if Nathan Holloway wanted a fight over a barn, I had a feeling he was about to regret starting one. The next morning, I was parked outside the county records building before they even unlocked the front doors. Now, if you've never spent time digging through government archives, let me save you some suspense. It's about as exciting as watching paint dry. Most people walk in there looking for one specific document and leave 20 minutes later. I walked in with nothing but a feeling. And somehow that feeling wouldn't leave me alone. The building hadn't changed much since I was a kid. Same old brick walls. Same faded county seal above the entrance. Same smell of dust, paper, and old air conditioning that always seemed one breakdown away from retirement. A woman behind the counter looked up as I walked in. "Can I help you?" "Maybe," I said. "I'm looking for historical land use records. Older county statutes, easements, governance agreements." She blinked. Most people ask for marriage licenses or property maps. Apparently nobody asks for century-old regulations before 9 in the morning. She pointed me toward the archive room, and that's where my week disappeared. For 3 straight days I went through records. Boxes, ledgers, maps, microfilm, documents so old they felt like they might turn into dust if you looked at them wrong. Meanwhile, the notices from Willow Ridge kept showing up. One on my gate, one on my mailbox, one taped to a fence post. The amount they claimed I owed climbed higher every day. 4,000 became 4,500, then 5,000, then 6,200. At some point, I stopped reading them. I stacked them in a kitchen drawer and kept digging. By Thursday afternoon, I finally found something interesting. Actually, that's not true. I found something strange. A development filing from several years earlier. The original Willow Ridge approval documents. Most of it was standard legal language. Property descriptions, infrastructure plans, road access agreements. Nothing unusual. Then I noticed a reference to neighboring agricultural land. My land. The wording caught my attention because it specifically acknowledged that surrounding properties retained independent status outside HOA governance. I read it 3 times, then 5. Then I made a copy. Now I wasn't just operating on instinct anymore. I had documentation, but I still wasn't satisfied because something about Nathan's confidence bothered me. People don't usually push that hard unless they think they're protected somehow. So I kept looking. Friday afternoon, buried inside a stack of county oversight regulations, I found the document that changed everything. And here's the funny thing. It wasn't dramatic. No giant headline. No flashing lights. No bold text saying congratulations, you found secret. Just a paragraph. One paragraph hidden in pages of legal language. But once I understood what it meant, I actually sat back in my chair and laughed. Because Willow Ridge hadn't just crossed a line. They had sprinted past it. The statute basically stated that any private governing body attempting to enforce regulations against non-member property owners could become subject to county review regarding the scope and legitimacy of its authority. In plain English, if an HOA started acting like a controlled land outside its jurisdiction, the county had every right to start asking questions. Lots of questions. The kind organizations hate answering. I made copies. Lots of copies. Then I drove home. The entire way back, I kept thinking about Nathan's voice on the phone. Visual impact extends beyond neighborhood boundaries. What a stupid sentence. Confident. Polished. Completely wrong. By Monday morning, I had hired an attorney. Not one of those flashy television lawyers. Just a local guy named Ben Crawford who'd spent 30 years handling land disputes. Ben read everything without saying much. When he finished, he leaned back in his chair. "You know," he said, "most people would have just paid the fine." "Yeah, you didn't." "Nope." A grin spread across his face. Good. That was the moment I knew we were going to get along. Within a week, we filed a formal petition requesting county review of Willow Ridge's enforcement actions. And once that paperwork landed on the right desks, things started moving. Slowly at first, then all at once. The county notified the HOA. The HOA notified their attorneys. Their attorneys immediately responded. Then the county requested records. Lots of records. Meeting minutes. Voting records. Enforcement histories. Financial statements. Policy amendments. Everything. And that's when the panic started. Not on my side. On theirs. I heard about the first emergency HOA meeting from Earl. Apparently half the neighborhood showed up. Residents wanted answers. Nathan stood at the front of the room, insisting everything was under control. That phrase never means everything is under control. In fact, I've learned it usually means the exact opposite. A few days later, another resident reached out to me directly. A woman named Linda, who lived inside Willow Ridge. She called because she'd heard rumors. At first, she sounded skeptical, then curious, then concerned. "Can I ask you something?" she said. "Sure. Did they really fine you even though you don't live here?" "Yep." There was silence. Then she said something that stuck with me. "If they can do that to you, how do we know where their authority stops?" That question started spreading through the neighborhood, because most homeowners had never actually examined the HOA's power. Why would they? People tend to assume systems work the way they're supposed to, until something forces them to look closer. Suddenly residents were reading bylaws, comparing meeting records, checking old votes, looking at amendments. And once people started looking, they began finding things. Small inconsistencies at first, missing signatures, improper notice periods, procedural shortcuts, nothing world-ending, but enough to make people uncomfortable. Then bigger issues started surfacing. Rules approved without complete board votes. Fines issued inconsistently. Policy changes with incomplete documentation. The deeper they dug, the worse it looked. Meanwhile, Nathan kept trying to project confidence. Unfortunately for him, confidence and evidence are two very different things. One evening, Ben called me. I could hear papers shuffling in the background. "You sitting down?" he asked. "Should I be? County's expanding the review." I felt my stomach tighten. Why? They found enough discrepancies to justify a broader audit. I stared out the window toward the barn. The old structure sat quietly in the fading evening light. Same barn, same boards, same roof. Yet somehow that building had become the center of something much larger than itself. What started as an ugly barn dispute was turning into a full examination of how Willow Ridge had been operating for years. And once government auditors get involved, things tend to develop a life of their own. Over the next month, the neighborhood transformed. People who'd never questioned anything suddenly became amateur investigators. Neighbors argued after meetings. Residents demanded explanations. Board members started distancing themselves from decisions they'd once supported. Finger-pointing became a weekly sport. Then one night something happened that changed the entire atmosphere. During a packed HOA meeting, a homeowner stood up and asked Nathan a simple question. Not an angry question, not a hostile one, just simple. If county records already said that land wasn't under our authority, why did you issue the fines? According to 3 different people who attended, the room went completely silent. Nathan tried answering. He talked about preserving standards, protecting values, community interests, but he never actually answered the question because there wasn't a good answer, and everybody in that room knew it. The next morning, word spread through Willow Ridge like wildfire. By then, the issue wasn't my barn anymore. It wasn't even about me. The real question had become something far more dangerous. If the board was willing to exceed its authority once, where else had it done the same thing? And that question was about to open doors nobody expected, including doors Nathan Holloway desperately needed to stay closed. By the time the county audit officially began, the atmosphere around Willow Ridge felt completely different. A few months earlier, the place had looked untouchable. Perfect lawns, perfect houses, perfect confidence. Now, every conversation seemed to happen in whispers. People who used to wave at each other from golf carts were standing in driveways, comparing documents. Residents were requesting records. Attorneys were showing up at meetings. Board members who once spoke with absolute certainty suddenly sounded like people choosing every word very carefully. And the truth was, none of it had anything to do with my barn anymore. That old building had simply been the loose thread. Once somebody pulled it, everything else started unraveling. The county auditors spent weeks reviewing records. Not days, weeks. And every update seemed worse than the one before. Financial inconsistencies, procedural violations, incomplete documentation, enforcement actions that couldn't be fully justified. Nothing dramatic enough for a movie courtroom scene. Actually, that was what made it so devastating. It was all paperwork. Cold, boring, undeniable. One evening, Ben called me while I was repairing a fence. I could hear the excitement in his voice before he even spoke. They're recommending restructuring. I leaned against the fence post. That's serious. Very serious. What happens now? He laughed. Now, the people who thought nobody was watching find out somebody was. A few weeks later, the final hearing arrived. I attended mostly because I wanted to see it through, not because I expected fireworks. And honestly, there weren't any. No dramatic speeches, no shouting matches, no television moments. Just facts, one after another. Documents, dates, records, questions, answers. The kind of slow pressure that eventually becomes impossible to escape. I remember looking across the room and seeing Nathan sitting with his attorneys. For the first time since this whole thing started, he looked tired. Not angry, not arrogant, just tired. Like a man realizing confidence can only carry you so far once reality catches up. Near the end of the hearing, the county issued its recommendation. The Willow Ridge Board would be dissolved pending full restructuring and compliance review. Just like that. Years of authority. Gone. The room became strangely quiet. Not shocked. More like people were finally hearing something they'd suspected was coming. Outside, the building residents gathered in small groups. Some looked relieved. Others looked frustrated. A few looked completely stunned. As for me, I got in my truck and drove home. No celebración. No victory lap. Just a long drive through the Tennessee countryside. When I pulled onto my property, the first thing I saw was the barn. Still standing exactly where it had always stood. Weathered. Crooked. Unimpressed by human drama. I walked over and rested my hand against one of the old wooden beams. For a second, I found myself thinking about my father. About all those summers. All those hours. All those nails. And I couldn't help smiling. Funny how the thing they called an eyesore ended up outlasting the people who tried to get rid of it. A few days later, I heard tires crunching across my driveway. I looked up and saw a black sedan slowly approaching. The driver parked near the barn, then stepped out. Nathan. For a moment, neither of us said anything. The last time we'd spoken, he'd been issuing threats from behind a desk. Now, he was standing on my property with his hands in his pockets, looking like a man trying to figure out how to start a conversation he didn't want to have. Finally, he nodded. Jack. Nathan. He glanced toward the barn, then back at me. I was hoping we could talk. I shrugged. You just started. That earned the smallest smile from him. Not because anything was funny, more because he knew he deserved that one. For several minutes, he talked about moving forward, community relationships, stability, future cooperation. The words sounded carefully chosen, like he'd rehearsed them on the drive over. Then came the offers. The association would formally withdraw all fines. They would recognize the structure as a protected agricultural building. There would be written guarantees preventing future enforcement actions. And then came the part that almost made me laugh. They were willing to contribute money toward cosmetic improvements to help the property better integrate with the surrounding visual environment. I looked at him, then looked at the barn, then back at him. Integrate. He exhaled slowly. Poor choice of words. Very poor choice of words. For the first time all day, we both laughed. Just a little. Then the silence returned. Eventually, Nathan said something unexpected. You know, I never thought it would go this far. And honestly, I believed him. Because that was the real lesson hiding underneath everything. Most people don't wake up planning to become villains. Most overreach starts with assumptions. Small assumptions. Nobody will push back. Nobody will ask questions. Nobody will challenge us. And those assumptions keep growing until someone finally says enough. After a while, Nathan looked at me. So, where do we go from here? I thought about that for a moment. Then I shook my head. We don't. He frowned. What does that mean? It means this was never about money. I looked toward the barn again. It was about boundaries. Nathan didn't argue, didn't defend himself, didn't try to negotiate. He simply nodded, because I think he finally understood. A few minutes later, he got back in his car and drove away. That was the last time I ever saw him. These days, the barn is still there. Same weatherboards. Same uneven roofline. Same history. People drive by it every day. Most don't give it a second thought. And honestly, that's perfectly fine with me. Because the older I get, the more I realize this story was never really about a barn. It was about something a lot bigger. Authority. The strange way people respond to it. The even stranger way people surrender to it. Most systems seem powerful because everybody assumes they are. Most rules seem unquestionable because nobody bothers questioning them. And sometimes that's perfectly reasonable. Sometimes authority is legitimate. Sometimes the rules make sense. But every now and then somebody pushes beyond the boundaries they're supposed to respect. And when that happens, one simple question can change everything. Do you actually have a right to do this? Not a loud question, not an angry question, just an honest one. Because if the answer is solid, you'll find out quickly. And if the answer starts getting complicated, defensive, or strangely emotional, well, sometimes that's where the real story begins. So now I'm curious what you think. If you walked outside tomorrow morning and found a notice demanding thousands of dollars from an organization that had no obvious authority over you, what would you do? Would you pay it and move on? Would you hire a lawyer? Would you ignore it completely? Or would you start digging until you've found the truth, no matter where it led? Drop your thoughts in the comments, because I've learned something from this whole experience. The most interesting part of any conflict usually isn't who wins. It's where people think the line should have been drawn in the first place. And trust me, that's a conversation people never seem to agree on.